It was the first truly chilly night of fall when he handed me the gift. I'd just come home from work, exhausted and weighed down by the events of the day. When I found him waiting in the living room with that lopsided smile I fell in love with so many years ago. His hands were clasped around a large, delicately wrapped box. "Open it," he urged, his eyes bright with a strange, almost nervous excitement. A rush of anticipation surged through me. We'd been married for nearly a decade, and while the early days had been filled with surprise gifts and spontaneous gestures, they'd become rare over time, replaced by the routines of day-to-day life. The gift in his hands was a departure from our usual rhythm, and I couldn't help but smile, warmed by his thoughtfulness. I carefully untied the ribbon and peeled back the paper, revealing a soft, elegant dress in a rich shade of emerald green. "You remember this dress?" he asked, watching my reaction closely. I furrowed my brow, confused. "I saw you looking at it in that boutique window last month," he said, a gentle smile gracing his face. "I know we didn't go inside, but the way you looked at it, I just knew you wanted it." I hadn't realized he'd noticed. There was a quiet beauty to that dress, the kind of subtle elegance that doesn't scream for attention but still demands it. And it touched me that he remembered a fleeting moment, that he'd gone out of his way to make that dress mine. "Oh, thank you," I whispered, running my fingers over the soft fabric. "It's beautiful. I love it." But as I wrapped my arms around him, inhaling the familiar scent of his cologne, a strange feeling prickled at the back of my mind, a faint but unshakable unease that I couldn't quite place. I brushed it aside. I wanted to savor this tender moment, this return to the warmth and thoughtfulness that had initially bound us together. Days passed and I wore the dress on a few occasions. Each time he'd shower me with compliments, telling me how beautiful I looked, how it suited me perfectly. And each time I felt that flicker of uncertainty, a nagging thought I couldn't pin down. Then one evening I went out to meet a few friends at a new restaurant in town. It was a chic spot, with soft lighting and an air of understated luxury. I was sipping a glass of wine, listening to my friend talking about her recent promotion, when something, or rather someone, caught my eye. She was tall, slender, with chestnut hair tumbling down her shoulders in soft waves. She wore an emerald green dress, one that looked strikingly similar to mine. At first I smiled to myself, thinking it was just a coincidence. But as I watched her laugh, her hand lightly resting on the arm of the man beside her, a chill settled over me. He leaned in close, his hand resting casually on her knee, his face obscured by shadows. The gesture was familiar, intimate, the kind that comes from a deep and personal connection. And then he shifted slightly, just enough for the dim light to catch his profile. My heart stopped. It was him, my husband, with another woman, his hand lingering too long, his face too close to hers. The world seemed to tilt, the restaurant sounds faded, and all I could hear was the pounding of my heart. I sat frozen, watching as he leaned in and whispered something in her ear, his mouth curving into the same smile he'd given me when he handed me the dress. The dress I now realized he had seen on her first. I felt a rush of nausea as the truth settled over me, heavy and suffocating. I looked down at my own dress, at the emerald green fabric that he'd so thoughtfully chosen. The dress he'd told me he'd noticed in a boutique window. The dress that now was nothing more than a lie, a deceit wrapped up in pretty fabric. I wanted to storm over, to demand an explanation, to make a scene that would tear through the restaurant like a thunderclap. But instead I sat in silence, rooted to my chair, feeling the weight of betrayal pressing down on me. I watched as they laughed together, their heads close, oblivious to the world around them. When I finally forced myself to look away, I caught my reflection in the darkened window beside me. My face looked foreign, pale and drawn, my eyes hollow. This dress, once a symbol of love, now felt like a cruel joke, an insult woven into every thread. I was a fool wearing a costume, a carefully crafted illusion of happiness, while the truth lay bare before me. I excused myself from my friends, muttering something about feeling unwell, and stumbled out into the crisp night air. The wind bit at my skin, but I welcomed the cold. It grounded me, forced me to focus on something tangible, something real. As I walked through the empty streets, my mind raced with questions, accusations, memories that now felt tainted and distorted. How long had he been lying to me? How many moments had he spent with her, promising her the same things he'd once promised me? And that dress, Had he chosen it because it looked good on her first, because he wanted to see both of us wrapped up in his deception? By the time I reached our front door, I felt numb, drained of everything except a bitter, simmering rage. I took one last look at the dress before slipping it off, letting it crumple into a heap on the floor. I wanted to tear it apart, to shred the fabric until there was nothing left, but I simply couldn't muster the energy. Instead, I left it there, discarded and unwanted, a hollow reminder of everything I'd thought we were. When he came home that night, he found me sitting in the dark, waiting. The confrontation was quiet, raw, and when he finally confessed, his words felt like ash in my ears. He stumbled through apologies, tried to tell me it hadn't meant anything, that he'd been stupid and selfish. But I'd seen the way he looked at her, the way he held her. It meant something, maybe everything. In the days that followed, I sifted through memories of our life together, searching for signs, for cracks I'd missed. But all I found was the relentless ache of betrayal, the bitter understanding that I'd been living in the shadows of his lies. The dress stayed on the floor untouched until I finally gathered the strength to throw it away. A small but necessary step toward reclaiming the pieces of myself he'd broken. That night, when I saw them together, something shifted irreversibly inside me. I knew I couldn't forgive him, couldn't rebuild on the ruins he'd left in his wake. The dress had been beautiful, but now it was nothing more than a scar, an indelible reminder of the truth I could never unsee. And as I moved forward, leaving him and the shattered remnants of our marriage behind, I promised myself one thing. Never again would I let someone else's lies define my worth. The days after our final conversation were strange and surreal, filled with echoes of what once was and reminders of what would never be again. Each morning I would wake up to an empty house that once held the laughter and warmth of a shared life. And each evening, I would return to silence, haunted by the absence of the man I thought I knew. But perhaps what struck me the most was how much life simply continued, indifferent to the ruin that lay smoldering within me. The streets were filled with people going about their lives, couples holding hands, families laughing, friends gathering at cafes. They all seemed so blissfully unaware of the agony that had hollowed me out, of the betrayal that had left me questioning everything I once believed. One afternoon, I found myself walking past the boutique where he'd claimed he'd first seen the dress. The shop window was different now, filled with winter coats and scarves, but the sight of that glass display still made my stomach clench. I could almost see my reflection from that night, could almost hear his words telling me how he'd noticed me looking at the dress and just knew I wanted it. How easily I'd believed him, how deeply I'd trusted that he knew me. I stood there staring at the reflections of strangers as they walked past, wondering how many of them were like me, clinging to illusions, unaware of the fractures running through their lives. I didn't realize how much time had passed until I felt the first sting of winter rain on my cheeks, snapping me out of my reverie. I pulled my coat tighter around myself, feeling an ache in my chest that refused to go away. There was a strange loneliness in that moment, standing in the rain, surrounded by strangers who had no idea what was tearing me apart. But somehow, that very loneliness gave me a small measure of strength. For the first time, I understood that this pain, this journey was mine and mine alone. And as much as it hurt, I knew that I had to face it head-on. The first steps toward rebuilding were the hardest. I moved through my days on autopilot, pushing myself to go through the motions, hoping that at some point, I'd feel like myself again. But everywhere I looked, there were reminders of him, of us, small, unremarkable details that felt loaded with meaning now. The chipped coffee mug he always used, the way the couch cushions were worn in the exact spot where he would always sit, the books we'd bought together that still sat on our shelves, gathering dust. Each item felt like a piece of our history, a history that was now tainted and stained by his deceit. Friends and family tried to support me, offering words of comfort, promises that I would find someone better, that I would be stronger for this experience. But those words rang hollow. They hadn't been there in the quiet moments when I'd poured everything I had into our life together, hadn't seen the small, tender gestures that once made us feel unbreakable. They couldn't understand the depth of the wound, the way it twisted and festered in the silence, growing darker with each passing day. In time, I realized that I couldn't keep clinging to the ghosts of our life together. The memories, the remnants, they were holding me hostage, trapping me in a loop of pain and regret. I began the slow, painful process of dismantling our home, packing up his belongings, boxing up the shared artifacts of our life, and trying to separate what was his from what was mine. It was exhausting work, both physically and emotionally, but with each item I set aside, I felt a little lighter, a little more in control. But the hardest part came when I reached the closet, where that damned green dress still hung, an untouched relic of a love that had never truly existed. I stared at it, hating it for what it represented, for the lie it had symbolized, and yet a small part of me wanted to keep it. A strange, twisted loyalty still clung to that dress, as if holding on to it would somehow preserve a piece of what we once were. In the end, I pulled it off the hanger and folded it neatly, placing it at the very bottom of the donation box. I couldn't bring myself to destroy it, but I also couldn't keep it. It was a relic, a reminder of a chapter that I needed to close. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into creating a new life, a life that was mine alone. I started taking long walks through the city, rediscovering parts of it I'd forgotten. I signed up for a pottery class, something I'd always wanted to do but had never made time for. I started cooking again, filling my kitchen with the scents of spices and fresh herbs, learning to enjoy the solitude instead of fearing it. One day, as I was wandering through a small art gallery, I found myself drawn to a painting on the wall, a simple abstract piece with deep, swirling colors that seemed to capture the chaos and beauty of human emotion. There was something raw and honest about it, something that resonated with the mess inside me. I stared at it for a long time, feeling a strange sense of comfort in its tangled, imperfect beauty. The gallery owner noticed my interest and came over, explaining that the artist had painted it during a difficult time in her life. She said it was her way of processing pain, he told me, a soft smile on his face. A way to let go of something she could never change. Those words stayed with me as I left the gallery. I realized that perhaps that was what I needed too. A way to let go. A way to make peace with a past that I could never rewrite. I couldn't erase the betrayal, couldn't undo the scars it had left, but maybe, just maybe, I could find a way to live with them. It was around this time that I started keeping a journal, pouring my thoughts onto paper in an attempt to make sense of the mess inside my heart. I wrote about everything, about the day we met, the years of laughter and love, the small moments that had once made us feel invincible. I wrote about the betrayal, about the searing pain of seeing him with her, of realizing that our life together had been a lie. And as I wrote, I felt the weight begin to lift, as if the words were slowly drawing the poison out of my wounds. With each entry, I felt myself growing stronger, more grounded. I was no longer the woman who had been broken by betrayal. I was someone new, someone shaped by pain but not defined by it. I realized that I didn't need closure from him, didn't need an apology or an explanation. The only closure I needed was my own. Months passed and the green dress became nothing more than a distant memory, a faint shadow in the story of my life. I rarely thought of him anymore, and when I did, it was with a sense of detachment, as if he were a character from a book I'd once read but had since set aside. My life was mine again, and for the first time in a long time I felt free. Then one day, as I was walking down the same street where the boutique once stood, I noticed that it had closed down, replaced by a new store filled with bright, colorful clothes. I paused for a moment, feeling a strange sense of nostalgia, but there was no pain, no bitterness, only a quiet, peaceful acceptance. I took a deep breath and kept walking, feeling the cool air against my skin, feeling alive, feeling whole. The betrayal was behind me, a chapter that had shaped me but would not define me. I was free to write my own story now, free to choose my own path. And with each step, I left a little more of the past behind, stepping into a future that was mine, and mine alone. As seasons slipped by, my life gradually began to feel like it was truly mine again. Days passed with less ache, and I became adept at navigating through old routines without the pang of betrayal or loss slicing into each moment. Slowly, the emptiness in my life began to fill, not with distractions, but with purpose, new connections, and even a sense of adventure I hadn't felt in years. One evening, I found myself in a small jazz bar downtown, a place I'd never been before but had heard about from a colleague. I'd gone there on a whim, craving something spontaneous, something that would break the pattern of solitude and healing that I'd been immersed in for months. The bar was dimly lit, cozy, with the rich scent of wood and bourbon hanging in the air. The jazz trio on stage was mid-performance, their music casting a spell over the crowd, drawing people into its smoky, hypnotic embrace. I took a seat near the back, feeling the music wash over me, lifting away remnants of worry I hadn't even realized were there. As I listened, my mind drifted back to the past, but in a gentler way, sifting through memories of my former self, a younger, hopeful woman who'd once been so deeply in love. I could feel the nostalgia, but it didn't hurt anymore. It was as if that love, even with its bitter end, was something that had helped shape me into the person I was now. The set ended, and as the musicians packed up their instruments, a man sat down at the table next to me. He looked about my age with kind eyes and an easygoing smile. He glanced over at me, then back to his drink, seemingly hesitant to strike up a conversation. Finally, he looked up and our eyes met. "Great set, wasn't it?" he asked, gesturing toward the stage. I nodded, smiling back. "Incredible. It's been ages since I've heard live jazz like that." He chuckled. "I know what you mean. There's just something about it. Raw and alive." He paused, studying me. "First time here?" "Yes," I admitted, feeling strangely vulnerable but open to the conversation. I don't usually do things like this on my own. But something about tonight made me want to come out. "I get it. Sometimes life just nudges you in a direction, and you go with it." He extended a hand. "I'm Evan, by the way." As we talked, I felt an unexpected warmth in his presence, a lightness that reminded me of parts of myself I hadn't known I'd lost. We chatted about everything and nothing, letting the conversation flow naturally. He was easy to talk to, open yet respectful, and I found myself laughing more than I had in months. There was no rush, no pressure, just a gentle sense of connection that felt refreshing. That night I went home with a lightness in my chest, and for the first time, I realized that maybe I was ready to let someone else into my world. It was a tentative thought, a spark of hope that hadn't felt safe before. I wasn't looking for anything serious, but the idea of opening up again, of sharing parts of my life and heart, didn't seem as impossible as it once had. Evan and I began seeing each other slowly without expectations. We would meet for coffee, go for walks, or explore different parts of the city together, finding beauty in small, unexpected moments. Our connection was gentle, without the intensity or passion that had once defined my relationship with my ex. But that gentleness felt like exactly what I needed. I found comfort in Evan's steadiness, in his ability to be present without demanding anything from me. He respected the walls I still had up, never pushing me to explain, never asking for more than I was willing to give. And in that safe space he created, I found myself opening up, bit by bit, story by story. One evening we sat together on a bench overlooking the river, the city lights shimmering across the water like stars. I told him about the betrayal, about the green dress that had once seemed like a gift but had turned into a symbol of lies. I was tentative at first, unsure how he would react, but he listened quietly without judgment, his hand gently resting on mine as I spoke. When I finished, he looked at me with such a soft expression, one filled with understanding and empathy. "I can't imagine how hard that must have been," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But look at you now. You're strong, you're resilient, and you're here living your life. That's something to be proud of." His words settled deep within me, offering a kind of validation I hadn't realized I needed. For so long I'd been focused on survival, on pushing through the pain, on building a life that was solely mine. But in that moment I understood that it was okay to let others in, to allow myself to be vulnerable again. Months turned into seasons, and my life blossomed in unexpected ways. I found myself exploring new interests, reconnecting with old friends, and even taking a solo trip to a cabin in the mountains. A dream I'd always had but had put on hold for too long. That trip was a turning point, a quiet escape that allowed me to confront the last remnants of the heartbreak, to truly let go of the pain that had shadowed me for so long. One morning during that trip, I hiked up a trail that led to a breathtaking overlook. As I reached the top, I stood there, taking in the vastness of the landscape, the rolling hills stretching out as far as the eye could see. The air was crisp, fresh, and I felt a deep sense of peace settle over me. I took a deep breath, feeling the cold fill my lungs, and as I exhaled, I imagined releasing every ounce of resentment, every lingering hurt, letting it all dissolve into the air around me. In that moment I forgave myself for trusting too deeply, for holding on too long, for every decision that had led me to heartbreak. I even felt a flicker of forgiveness for my ex, not because he deserved it, but because I deserved freedom from the pain he'd left in his wake. I wasn't the person I had been before him, but I wasn't defined by his betrayal either. I was someone new, someone forged through fire and loss, someone strong enough to find beauty in broken places. When I returned to the city, I brought that peace back with me. Evan and I continued seeing each other, and as our relationship deepened, I found myself trusting again, not because I'd forgotten the betrayal, but because I had finally healed enough to move forward. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. Not the kind I'd once imagined, but it was real, and it was mine. I no longer needed the promises or illusions of the past. I had something far more valuable. A life I had built on my own terms, filled with people and moments that brought me joy. In time, the green dress and everything it symbolized faded from my memory, replaced by the warmth of new beginnings, by the quiet confidence that I could survive anything life threw my way. I still thought of that night in the restaurant occasionally, still remembered the way my heart had shattered when I saw him with her. But those memories no longer held power over me. They were simply part of my story, chapters in a book that I'd closed, lessons that had taught me to trust myself, to honor my own worth above anyone else's. And as I walked through the city, feeling the cool autumn air against my skin, I realized that I was no longer defined by that heartbreak. I was a woman who had loved deeply, who had faced betrayal, and who had come out the other side stronger, wiser, and unbreakably whole. Time became my ally, a quiet healer smoothing over the sharp edges of the past. Life had taken on a new rhythm, a rhythm that belonged entirely to me. Evan and I grew closer, our connection deepening in ways I hadn't anticipated but felt thankful for every day. He was the calm in my storm, a steady hand that guided me through my moments of uncertainty without judgment. With him, I discovered a softness in myself that I thought had been lost forever, a gentle openness that was rooted in resilience rather than naivete. Yet there were times when echoes of my past would unexpectedly surface, catching me off guard in ways I hadn't anticipated. I remember once, as I sorted through an old box of photos I'd kept from our former life, I came across a picture of us on vacation, standing on a beach in the late afternoon sunlight, laughing as if the world belonged to us. Looking at that picture felt surreal, like peering into the life of a stranger. It was a life I could remember but no longer felt connected to. I realized that what I had shared with my ex was only a part of my journey, a stepping stone that had ultimately led me to where I was now. As weeks turned into months, I began to find small joys in the simplest of things. A quiet morning with a book, a cup of coffee, a walk in the park as the leaves turned golden in the fall. I felt like I was seeing the world with fresh eyes, learning to appreciate life for its own beauty, not for what it offered in terms of love or companionship. It was a new kind of fulfillment, one that stemmed from within, a contentment that no one else could give me. I also found myself saying yes to things I would have once hesitated over. I traveled solo more often, exploring cities and towns I'd only ever seen in pictures. I began attending events and workshops alone, meeting people who were passionate, alive, unencumbered by expectations. It was exhilarating, a kind of liberation I hadn't known I'd craved. And every time I came home, I felt as though I'd brought back a new piece of myself, a version of me that was whole, fearless, and no longer haunted by what had been lost. During this time, Evan continued to be a quiet presence in my life, never pushing, always patient. He became a part of my new world, but in a way that respected my independence. He understood the layers of my heart, knew that some walls took longer to come down, and he seemed content to walk alongside me, even if it meant at a distance at times. There was something unspoken between us, a bond built on mutual respect and quiet understanding. He didn't try to fix me, didn't try to make me forget my past. Instead, he held space for me, allowing me to grow and heal in my own way at my own pace. One winter evening, as the city sparkled with holiday lights, he invited me to a dinner with some of his close friends. At first, I hesitated, worried that stepping into his world, meeting people he held dear, would mean committing to something I wasn't sure I was ready for. But he looked at me with such gentle confidence, as if he knew I was ready, even if I didn't. So I agreed, and that evening, I found myself sitting around a warmly lit table, laughing with strangers who quickly became friends. There was no pressure, no expectation, only a sense of belonging, a sense that I was right where I was meant to be. After dinner, as we walked down the street lined with holiday decorations, Evan took my hand, his grip warm and steady. "Thank you for coming tonight," he said, his voice soft but filled with meaning. It means a lot to me. I looked up at him, feeling a warmth in my chest that was both familiar and new. Thank you, I whispered back. For being patient. For all of this. He smiled, squeezing my hand. We didn't need to say more. It was enough, that quiet understanding between us, that sense of moving forward together even if slowly. In the months that followed, we continued to build a life that was uniquely ours. It wasn't a whirlwind romance. It didn't have the dramatic highs and lows of my past relationship. But it was steady, real, built on a foundation of trust and quiet affection. With Evan, I felt safe, cherished, not because he completed me, but because he respected and celebrated the person I'd become on my own. One day, as spring began to bloom around us, I realized just how far I'd come. I had created a life that was fulfilling, a life filled with friends, passions, and a love that was kind and gentle. The shadows of my past had faded, replaced by the bright, hopeful light of a new beginning. I was no longer the woman who had been broken by betrayal. I was someone transformed, someone who had taken that pain and turned it into strength, compassion, resilience. On a quiet morning, as I sat by my window watching the city wake up, I thought back to that green dress, to the moment I discovered the betrayal that had once shattered me. What once felt like a scar now felt like a badge of honor, a reminder of everything I'd overcome. I knew that, in some strange way, that moment had been necessary. It had forced me to confront parts of myself I might have never seen, had pushed me to discover depths of strength I hadn't known I possessed. And as I sipped my coffee, wrapped in the warmth of my new life, I felt a profound sense of gratitude, not for the betrayal itself, but for the woman I had become because of it. I was whole, I was strong, and I was finally truly at peace. The future stretched out before me, filled with endless possibilities, and for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to embrace it, with no fear, no hesitation, and no regrets. As spring deepened into summer, my world continued to expand in ways I hadn't anticipated. With each passing day, I found myself embracing new experiences and gradually letting go of the guardedness I had clung to for so long. The walls I had carefully built around my heart began to soften, and I discovered a lighter, freer version of myself emerging. Someone who was finally able to find joy in the simple, everyday beauty around me. Evan and I continued our journey together, and our bond grew stronger in small, quiet moments that felt as significant as grand declarations. One evening, we decided to take a spontaneous weekend trip to the coast. The air was warm with the lingering scent of salt and pine as we drove along the winding roads, the windows down and music filling the car. It felt like a kind of freedom I hadn't known in years, freedom from my own past, from my fears, from the life I'd once thought I was destined to live. When we reached the coast, we checked into a small bed and breakfast nestled on a cliff overlooking the ocean. The room was quaint, with soft, worn linens and a large window that framed the endless expanse of water. That night after dinner, we took a walk along the beach, the sound of the waves mingling with our laughter. Evan held my hand as we walked, his fingers intertwined with mine in a way that felt natural and comforting. As we reached a secluded part of the shore, he stopped, turning to face me. There was a seriousness in his eyes, a gentle vulnerability I hadn't seen before. "I know you've been through so much," he began softly, his gaze steady. "And I don't want to rush anything, or push you to feel something you're not ready for. But I need you to know that you mean more to me than I ever thought possible. I'll wait as long as it takes, and if you're never ready for more, that's okay. But I'm here, for however long you'll have me." The sincerity in his words took my breath away. I felt my heart swell with an emotion I could barely name, something that was equal parts gratitude, love, and the profound realization that I had found someone who truly understood me. I took his hands in mine, feeling a warmth spread through me that reached places I thought had long gone cold. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice catching slightly. "Thank you for giving me space, for letting me find my way back to myself. I'm ready, Evan. I'm ready to build something real with you." His eyes softened and a slow, genuine smile spread across his face. In that moment, under the vast night sky, I felt something click into place. An understanding, a connection that went beyond words. We stood there for a long time, simply holding each other, letting the waves and the stars bear witness to the quiet, sacred promise we'd made. In the weeks that followed, we began talking more about the future. For the first time, the idea of sharing my life with someone felt exciting rather than frightening. Evan and I started making plans, not in a way that felt rushed or overwhelming, but with the quiet certainty that comes from knowing you found a home in another person. One warm afternoon, as we strolled through a neighborhood park, I found myself sharing dreams I'd barely dared to think about before. Things like traveling to Europe, learning to paint, even adopting a dog. He listened intently, his hand lightly resting on my back, offering encouragement and ideas of his own. We laughed, imagined a life that felt expansive and full, a life that would continue to unfold, layer by layer, with love and trust as its foundation. Later that summer, Evan suggested we take an art class together, something he'd remembered I'd once mentioned in passing. We signed up for a weekend watercolor workshop, and every Saturday morning, we found ourselves in a sunlit studio, surrounded by brushes, palettes, and canvases waiting to be brought to life. At first, we were both hesitant, unsure of our skills, laughing as we tried to capture landscapes and shapes that seemed to evade us. But over time, I found myself falling in love with the creative process, with the way colors blended and bled together, forming something beautiful and unexpected. Those weekends in the studio became a kind of ritual, a place where I could express parts of myself I hadn't realized were still there. With each brushstroke, I felt myself letting go of the perfectionism, the need for control, the fear that had once gripped me so tightly. Art became a language I could speak without hesitation, a space where I could simply be, without the weight of expectation or judgment. One day, as we were packing up our supplies, Evan looked at me with a soft, thoughtful expression. "You know," he said, "I think you're finding yourself all over again. And it's beautiful to watch." His words stayed with me, resonating in ways I hadn't expected. I realized he was right. Through this journey, I had found pieces of myself that had been buried beneath the pain, the heartbreak, the years of defining myself through the lens of others. I was no longer the person I had been before my marriage, nor was I the broken woman I'd become in its aftermath. I was someone new, someone stronger, someone who had learned to trust herself, her instincts, her own heart. As fall approached, Evan and I decided to move in together. It was a decision that felt natural, the next step in a journey we were both ready to embrace. We found a small apartment in a lively part of town, with large windows that let in the morning sun and a tiny balcony just big enough for a few potted plants. Moving in together was both exciting and challenging, as we learned to navigate the rhythms of shared space, the quirks and habits that come with truly letting someone into your life. But with every new day, I felt a sense of belonging, of having found a place where I could be fully myself. We filled our new home with laughter, late-night talks, quiet mornings spent sipping coffee as the city woke up around us. We hung our paintings on the walls, each one a testament to the journey we'd taken together, to the life we were building one brushstroke at a time. We even adopted a dog, a sweet, scruffy rescue named Max, who quickly became the heart of our little family, bringing endless joy and a sense of completeness to our home. One evening, as we sat on the balcony watching the sun set over the city, Evan took my hand, his gaze steady and filled with a quiet love that had come to mean everything to me. "We've come so far," he murmured, his thumb gently tracing circles on my hand. "Sometimes I think about that first night we met, how you seemed like this strong, resilient woman with so many layers. And I realize now you are that woman, but you're also so much more." I looked at him, feeling a deep gratitude that words could barely capture. "Thank you for seeing me," I whispered. "For seeing all of me, even the parts one was afraid to share." We sat there in comfortable silence, watching as the world around us softened into twilight. I knew that life would bring challenges, that there would be moments of uncertainty and struggle, but I also knew that I was no longer alone. I had built a life that was mine, a life that was full, vibrant, and true. In that quiet moment, as the stars began to dot the sky, I felt a peace that went beyond happiness, a peace that came from knowing I was exactly where I was meant to be, with a man who loved me not for who I had been, but for who I had become. And as I leaned into his embrace, I knew that the journey we'd started together was just the beginning of a story that would continue to unfold, filled with love, trust, and the quiet, enduring strength that only comes from having been truly seen. The more we settled into our new life together, the more I realized that happiness wasn't a grand, sudden moment but a quiet, steady feeling that grew and deepened with each passing day. It wasn't in the big gestures or planned occasions. It was in the small, seemingly unremarkable moments that stitched our days together, moments that often passed without fanfare but left a lasting warmth in their wake. One Saturday morning I woke up to find Evan already up, standing in the kitchen, attempting to make pancakes. The kitchen was a mess. Flour dusted over the counter, a trail of eggshells and a dripping bottle of maple syrup, but the sight of him utterly absorbed in his task made me laugh. He turned, grinning sheepishly, his face smudged with a bit of flour. "You weren't supposed to see this until it was perfect," he said, looking both embarrassed and amused. I walked over, sliding my arms around his waist. "Perfect isn't nearly as charming as this," I murmured, pressing a kiss to his cheek. We spent the morning laughing, eating slightly burnt pancakes, and talking about everything and nothing. I couldn't remember a time I'd felt so content, so anchored in the simple joy of the present. Those little moments strung together made me realize that happiness wasn't something that needed to be chased or earned. It was there, waiting to be noticed, in every corner of the life we'd built together. Our weekends turned into rituals of discovery. We'd take Max on long walks through different neighborhoods, stopping at quaint coffee shops or little antique stores, finding hidden gems in the city. Sometimes we'd simply sit in the park, people watching, sharing stories and letting our imaginations run wild. Evan had a knack for making me laugh, for pulling me out of my own head and bringing me back to the here and now. He had a way of finding joy in the smallest things, and with him I learned to see the world with fresh eyes. And then as the year drew to a close and the first snow began to fall, Evan surprised me with something I never expected. A gift that left me both speechless and overwhelmed with emotion. It was a simple, beautifully bound notebook, with soft cream-colored pages and a small gold inscription on the cover that read, "For the journey." Inside he'd written a single line, "Write your own story page by page. I'll be with you every step of the way." I looked up at him, feeling a lump form in my throat. I hadn't mentioned my writing to him much, but he must have known from our conversations, from the way I'd light up whenever I talked about books or told him about the stories I'd once dreamed of creating. Writing had always been a part of me, something I'd set aside after years of life getting in the way. But here he was, gently encouraging me to rediscover that passion, to reclaim something that had been lost. "It's just a little encouragement," he said softly, his hand resting on mine. "I know how much it means to you, and I want you to have that, your own voice, your own stories. Whatever you write, wherever it takes you, I'll be there." Tears pricked my eyes as I hugged him, overwhelmed by his thoughtfulness. That notebook became a precious part of my days, a place where I poured out my thoughts, memories, and the beginnings of stories I'd longed to write. Evan never pressured me to share what I'd written. He simply supported me, creating space for me to rediscover my creativity, to reconnect with a piece of myself I hadn't touched in years. As winter deepened, my writing became a form of therapy, a way to continue healing, to explore and process everything I'd been through. I wrote about my past, about the woman I used to be, the pain and betrayal that had once defined me. But I also wrote about joy, about finding love again, about the quiet, transformative beauty of letting go. Each page felt like a step forward, a piece of my soul being woven into a new, stronger tapestry. One evening, as I was finishing up a short story I'd been working on for weeks, Evan came and sat beside me, watching me with a quiet smile. "You know," he said, his voice gentle, "I've never seen you so at peace. You're really blossoming." I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through me. "I think I finally feel free," I admitted. Free from everything I was holding on to, free to just be. And it was true. I felt whole in a way I hadn't thought possible, as though every broken piece of my past had found its place, creating a mosaic that was uniquely mine. I had learned to forgive, not just my ex but myself, for the choices I'd made, for the moments when I'd stayed too long, for the times I'd let my own needs go unheard. And with that forgiveness came a kind of peace that filled me with quiet strength. As the snow continued to fall outside, I realized that I wasn't just closing the chapter on my past. I was opening a new one filled with love, creativity, and a deep sense of purpose. I was writing my own story day by day with Evan by my side, and with every page, I felt myself moving closer to a future that was vibrant, alive, and filled with endless possibility. Then one quiet evening in early spring, as the city began to thaw and the first blossoms appeared on the trees, Evan knelt beside me in our tiny living room, Max curled up beside us. In his hand he held a simple ring, a delicate band with a small shimmering stone that caught the light just so. His face was filled with a tender vulnerability I'd never seen before, his eyes full of love and hope. "I want you to keep writing your story," he said, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "But I'd like to be a part of it, for as long as you'll have me. Will you marry me?" Time seemed to stop. I felt every heartbeat, every breath, and a flood of memories surged through me. The hurt, the healing, the quiet moments that had led us here. And in that moment I knew without a doubt that this was exactly where I was meant to be. "Yes," I whispered, my voice barely audible as I felt tears fill my eyes. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." As he slipped the ring onto my finger, I felt an indescribable joy, a feeling of completeness that went beyond words. I had found my way back to myself, and in doing so I had found a love that was true, steady, and enduring. Our wedding was a small, intimate gathering in a sunlit garden, surrounded by the people who mattered most to us. There was no fanfare, no extravagance, just the simplicity of two people choosing each other, promising to walk life's path together, come what may. As we stood there hand in hand, I felt the weight of every experience, every choice, every heartbreak that had led me to this moment. And I felt nothing but gratitude. In the years that followed, Evan and I built a life rich in laughter, adventure, and quiet contentment. I continued writing, filling page after page with stories, memories, and dreams. We traveled, explored, took risks, and grew together, finding joy in the mundane and magic in the everyday. And through it all, I held on to that notebook he'd given me, each page a testament to the journey I'd taken. From heartbreak to healing, from loss to love, from brokenness to wholeness. It was a story that was uniquely mine, and I knew that with Evan by my side it was only just beginning. As I look back now years later, I can say with certainty that every moment of pain, every tear, every difficult decision was worth it, for it led me to a life that was true, a love that was unwavering, and a self that was stronger, braver, and more complete than I ever could have imagined.